Hey YouTube. So this is exciting for me. It's probably not exciting for anyone else, but I think I finally understand how nonlinear time works. Let me explain what I'm talking about. For a while I had, this mostly came up with a partner I had where she would um, say things like, time is a social construct, or, time is bullshit. Time isn't linear. And I'd be like, yeah, true. So I don't get it at all. And I knew I didn't get it at all. And I mean, I'd say that and I'd be like, I totally understand the theory or the like perspective that time is non-linear. Um, but I'm a white person from a like European background, and to me, time is linear, and I don't really have a worldview that says anything different. And my partner being native, I think, like, was part of it too, is that like she just had a different perspective on the world, which I thought was awesome. And like, I wish that like I wish there was a way that you could just switch your brain and be like, yeah, the culture and background that I come from is, not the like understanding of the world I want to have, or the only understanding of the world I want to have, so I'm going to switch it. But it's not that easy. So I've been thinking about this though, thinking about nonlinear time and trying to understand it. And I think I kind of sort of am starting to get it. And so if you are also somebody who is like, yes, this idea that time isn't linear, um, like appeals to me, but I can't really grok it, maybe this will help for you. And one of the ways that I'm starting to understand it is through things like the concept of a year card. If you know anything about tarot numerology, if you've heard of this idea that you have like a card for each year, or that the collective has a card, there's a particular card that goes with the year, or even like more simply like the idea of the zodiac, the idea of like signs that come back around depending on when you're born, or that different planets are different signs at different times. Both of those are concepts of a circle, right? It's cyclical, or even you could say sporadic, but like in both cases, it doesn't end, or the zodiac doesn't like just keep going infinitely. It comes back. And I understand this a little better, I think, with the year card, or with your personal year card, in the sense that like you have, say, an Empress year, and then you go through those lessons and you learn those lessons, and then you don't have one for a long time, but eventually you'll have another Empress year, and you're not learning the exact same things necessarily, although you might be, and you might be just learning them again, but you're still layering onto what you learned before. So from that perspective, you came back, like time came back to that point. You came back to that lesson, different and changed, but like you keep layering back to that lesson. Another example would be like, so if we think from a perspective of an individual human, then, and we know that we have relatively short lives. If your perspective is entirely individual, and especially if you both have an individual perspective and your society is really focused on progress, like white Western society is, right? It's all about like development, it's all about progress, the industrial revolution, like everything is about getting further, technology progressing. I think it leads us each in our individual lives to also think about our lives like that. So to think of, I mean, not that the goal is death exactly, but like the goal is to end up at some successful point when you're old. And the idea is that you keep going forward. And I think we penalize people, or we encourage people to feel shame if they go backwards. So you look at all these articles about like millennials moving in with their parents, and it's like, you failed because you're not moving straight up. You had a dip, or you had a step back, to a state that you were in before. And we're encouraged in this particular society, specifically, we're encouraged to think of that as a failure or bad, or if we don't keep moving along the trajectory, if we have a stumble or we have a back, that it's a bad thing rather than being a natural thing, or rather than being, one direction that one can move. Because really life is more like this. It's not It's not a straight line. Right. So if that is your perspective, then I think it's really hard to think of time. I think linear time makes sense, and it's really hard to understand folks who don't think the linear time makes sense. And it may be that if you are from a culture with a more collective viewpoint that doesn't have this linear view of progress, and that doesn't have this very individualistic look at things, that it's easier to understand. Because if you look at time from a different perspective, rather than an individual human being, like, let's say you look at time from the perspective of a tree. Well, a tree has a much longer lifespan and also experiences things very clearly in cycles. So, a tree goes through seasons, and through its long life, everything is, keeps happening again. And there might be one season where there's less water or less sunlight, or there might be a season where the tree is damaged. So there are differences, but from the perspective of a tree, I don't know that it would make sense to just think of time as a straight line, because it's really just like coming back, coming back, coming back. Or let's think of like time from the perspective of the moon, to think of something that has maybe not an infinite life, but sort of like, from our perspective, a fairly infinite life. If the perspective of the moon would not be a straight line going to a particular point, because the death of the moon, or the end of the moon as an entity, is so far in the future that it makes absolutely no sense. So from the perspective of the moon, everything is phases and cycles, predictable. In the case of the moon, like, everything is pretty much the same, but things keep going around and around. It is our short life that encourages us to focus on the end of it, and encourages us to think of time as something that goes to an end point. But if you think from the perspective of a planet, or a mountain, or a river, something that maybe isn't infinite, but in some ways feels like it, then linear time doesn't make as much sense. If you think from a population perspective, then linear time doesn't make as much sense. It might be that time is more like waves, or sort of layers of different generations, but it's not a straight line. You can even kind of think of time as almost being like, I keep saying cyclical, but it's also not even cyclical, kind of like time is expansion and contraction. So like, time from the perspective of, say, a tree is, periods of bigger growth and periods of less growth, and periods of bigger growth and periods of less growth. It's expansion and contraction. If you think of the entire forest, a forest might be killed off, a forest might be cut down, but eventually humans are all going to die out, and then the forest will come back. So from that perspective, it's like there might be a very bad period, and then it comes back. So I'm not going to say that I 100% get it, or that my brain has changed the way I think of time so that linear time doesn't make sense to me. It still makes a lot of sense to me. But I think I understand a little more where people are coming from when they think of nonlinear time. And it makes sense that folks who are, for example, native to North America, and have a more collective viewpoint and have a more animistic viewpoint, might consider time in different ways. Yeah. Curious if you have thoughts, leave them below in a comment. Like and subscribe. Let me know if you are interested in this topic, or if you have anything to add, and we'll see you next time.